what is archaeology? We will tell you a little bit about the discipline today, how we got to it, who we are, a little bit about our quite unusual trajectories, but usual for archaeologists. And we will also tell you a little bit about how we study some big processes that might be very relevant for what we are experiencing today.
Okay, what is archaeology? The first or the basic question. So how do we imagine a life of an archaeologist? You certainly know archaeology primarily from the movies, or some of you from the exhibition in the museums or computer games. But archaeology is for sure different, a little bit different, and we will show you what is it. In any case, archaeology is not about dinosaurs. So the last picture, Jurassic World, is not the right one. Archaeology is a study of a human past through material remains. So today we will show you what real archaeologists are doing, and that is still more interesting than what they show you in the movies.
So who we are, my name is Diana. I grew up in Liptovské Mikuláš in Slovakia, and I got really lucky. When I was 16, I went to study in Italy at an international school called United World Colleges. This one was the College of Adriatic. And after my studies in Italy, I kind of realized a number of things. One was that I'm quite interested in approaching the study of human behavior and who we are, what we do, from multidisciplinary perspectives. I was originally going to go into biology and chemistry, but I realized I just don't want to spend my life in the lab. So I really liked archaeology as a way to understanding who we are, what we've done from this, deep historical perspective, kind of thinking about, humans. And then I said, why don't I just try to be in a discipline that is incredibly diverse, where I can apply different approaches to, addressing different topics worldwide. So I went to study my undergraduate in classics in Canada. And after that, I went to the University of Michigan to study for a PhD in classical art and archaeology. But I would stylize myself more of what we call a prehistorian. So I'm particularly interested in the second and the first millennium, the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, before the invention of writing in the Greek world. So I really do study the periods where there was really not much writing. There is writing in the Bronze Age, but that we actually study mostly through material remains. Marek?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. So my name is Marek, and was already mentioned, I did my first degree at the university in Slovakia, in Trnava. And after finishing my MA, I moved to Germany. First based on Erasmus program, or using the Erasmus program, and they starting my PhD studies in a small university in Bavaria. And after that, after finishing my PhD, I worked several years for museums and archaeological institutions in Germany and Turkey until 2017, when I moved to Prague, so not back to Slovakia, but to former Czechoslovakia, and start to work there as a senior lecturer. My focus is on a period slowly after that, what Diana was speaking about, that means Iron Age, the classical Greek, and Hellenism, Alexander the Great. Basically, my interest is in these societies, on cultures, but the questions what's beyond the written sources. That means how did the people live, and not only about what we know about from the written sources, but also what we can see in the material remains, in the settlements, in the necropolises, or the sanctuaries of ancient Greeks. And yeah, that's basically what we are doing. And where we are actually conducting our research. So you see, as a classical or prehistoric archaeologist, you can work both in Central Europe as well as in the Mediterranean, since the methodology is very similar or the same. So the things you learn, you can apply on different sites, not only in the Mediterranean, but in other parts of the world, for example, in Central America or in islands in the Red Sea or in the Near East. In respect to Jana and me, we are working in a region between Spain and Georgia. The main focus is on the Aegean, means on the sites in Greece, in Northern Macedonia, and in Turkey. Thank you. But we try to expand our research also to other areas like Italy or Spain, and to cooperate with colleagues who are locally working on in these regions.
Yeah, so the one cool thing about archaeology is that it's incredibly international. So as Marek moved between, Slovakia, Germany, and the Czech Republic, I moved between North America, and I came to London, and I live in London. And it's really great. It's really great that it's not just you, but it's all these people from all over the world thinking about the same questions, and that you're not. You don't really need to study just one period, one country, but you really can look at connections. And actually my interest is in ancient migrations and mobility. So how did people move and why did they move? And one of the really cool things is that historically you realize that people move much more often than we would give them credit to. So this is a little bit of a background about us. And now we're going to tell you a little bit about how does archaeology work? How do we work? What do we do? Because believe it or not, we are not always in the field like Indiana Jones or Larou Croft and doing crazy things. Archaeology might be a little bit more boring and is a bit more tedious, but we think that it's incredibly exciting, no matter what. So when you have an image of an archaeologist, you really think about excavations of us digging the ground and finding hidden features, but that's not quite always the case. Excavations is a big part of archaeology, but we also do different types of research, such as survey, which means that we walk the landscape and we look at features that are still visible on the surface. Pottery, so ceramic sherds, for instance, are very often found on surfaces, and we collect those, and we can tell what were the ancient habitation patterns. After the field work, field collections, we then focus a lot of our time on the processing of what we find, and that's anything from imagery, from architecture, from individual objects. After that period is done, we write up our reports so that the academic as well as the public community know what we have looked at.
Yeah, but prior to the excavation, you have to know where do you want to make a dig or to excavate. And therefore, in the recent years, the importance of so-called survey is increasing. And it's not only about walking in wonderful areas, as we are actually doing, but also to conduct some remote sensing survey. And in terms of this remote sensing, we are using the modern equipment like drones, also geophysics, and we are cooperating with our colleagues from geology. So we are doing some corings in the rivers, or with colleagues from who are doing epigraphy, so searching for lost or unknown inscriptions. And also then after you find a site, you have to do some measuring to make exact GPS points, and therefore also the cooperation with the colleagues from geoinformatics is very important.
Yeah, so archaeology is not just looking for, the shiny gold or for the big citadels, the big, settlements that once were inhabited, in which people lived, but it's a lot of diverse methods that actually make it even more exciting, because just you can imagine the amount of information that we can get through these different techniques.
Yeah, one of these is already mentioned, remote sensing by or using drones. So you can first map all of the area and then create a 3D model. And based on this 3D model or based on the imaginary, you can see already the lost structures. So then you can take the shovel, go to this place and make an excavate. It's going actually for us to be much more easier to find such places, and you don't have to excavate with hundreds of people on one side for several months, like in the 19th century, but you can exactly go to an exact place where you think you will find something. For example, on this picture on the left, you see the lines and the dots, and these lines showed us where the ancient fields were in the Roman period. The red dots or clusters of dots showed us the Roman structures. And as a colleague of us on the picture, you have to do a lot of computer working.
Yeah, so it sometimes can get a bit overwhelming, just the amount of information you need to know and need to understand. So a big part of it, as I said, so we work in the field, we collect our material culture, the information, we excavate things, we find things as we're walking the countryside in the survey. But what then? So we talked about more the computer applications, and here you see the lab-heavy work. So on the picture on the top right, you can see some restoration of what we found. Very often the things we find are extremely fragmentary. We find sherds, so those are broken ceramic vessels. We find corroded metals, such as weapons and utensils, and many other things. But all of these, first of all, need to be cataloged. They need to be restored so that we actually can figure out what we're working with. On the bottom left, you see our colleague Umit from Turkey doing some analysis on ancient metals and drilling. In the center is my colleague Angela working in Georgia and looking at remains of plants, of ancient plants and botanical remains. And then on the right is laser-aided profiler, which is a automated machine developed by our colleague Peter Demian, who is at Charles University at the moment, to draw pottery. So we need to catalog everything that we find. So it's not just, you just go in, you find things and it's all great. You first have to do your due diligence, you have to do your nitty-gritty cataloging so that you know what you find and you know how to present it, and you can present it in a way that other people can also work with it.
And the next step is actually the work in laboratory, and in this case we are cooperating with different types of specialists who help us to analyze both the smaller pieces from ancient DNA, already mentioned plant remains, or highly corroded and fragmented pieces. And putting all this together, we can then get a picture, a broad picture about the landscape, about the area, or about the people who actually use these plants to get some food. And the last, and I think the most important step is the public outreach, because we are not doing science to do some science, but we are doing science to present it to the public, who is finally financing us in terms of taxes. So what types of public outreach do we have? On the one hand, these are the publications, that are the monographies or articles, highly scientific articles, but also books for the public. And on the other hand, these are exhibitions. And exhibitions are the most popular type of public outreach, that we show the finds which were found, I don't know, in Slovakia, to the locals, that they can actually identify themselves with their own culture.
Yeah, and this step is really important, and really that's what we're focusing on. So even though you think that we spend most of our time in the field, doing the research, we really spend most of our time working at universities and working in our laboratories and putting together all these different outputs. So we write a lot. We also think about how to present these interpretations of the past to the public in terms of, as Marek mentioned, exhibitions, but also in terms of other activities, that engage the public, because, past is material and we contribute to it. So, maybe think about that next time you go to Děvín or I don't know, an open air museum or something like that. So why archaeology? Why should you care? Why is it important? Well, I guess for most people, it's fun. We love what we do. We get to travel, we get to meet a lot of different people. When I was a PhD student, I actually got to live in Greece and Turkey for a year and a half each. So I spent actually a lot of my time while I was studying in the US abroad on different scholarships. And I got to see a lot. I got to understand a lot of different things that are connected to my field. And here are just a few pictures. So that's me and my colleague on admiring an early archaic Greek sculpture. In the middle, that's us hiking at the end of the season in Georgia. And then on the right, it's my next picture, which I'm not quite sure what that is.
It's from Northern Macedonia, from the Ohrid Lake, where we are conducting survey since 2018. So you get a wonderful panorama during the survey, so you can connect actually the work with pleasure in this case.
Yeah, but we are not in archaeology because it's fun and exciting. That is a part of it. But what we really love is that it's incredibly exciting and rapidly changing discipline. So what we told you about the new methods, how we approach, computer programming in archaeology and all that, that's really what's been happening in the last 10 years. So we're not bored. We always have something new to learn as we're teaching our students at university, as we're talking to our colleagues. And really archaeology is a rapidly changing discipline. So really we moved to what we're presenting to you now, in the last 100 years when people went to excavate, the large temples and rich cemeteries, the discipline has completely transformed about what our goals are and what our methods and techniques are.
Yes, I mean, in the last, let's say, decades, the archaeology as a discipline, as a scientific discipline, changed. And if you would read some books about archaeology, which were written 40 years ago, you will see that archaeology is only a discipline like such as history. So we are having actually history with our finds. But in the meantime, because of the rapid development of both or of IT or genetics and also chemistry and statistics, we can use these developments also in our discipline. Because if you are trying to understand the past societies, the way how the ancient people lived, you get a lot of different data you need to evaluate. So you are working not only with the shards, but you are also working with the bones, you are working with the geology, with sediments. And if you want to understand it, you have to be, to a certain degree, a generalist. So on the one hand, you certainly have to use your computer skills, and on the other hand, it's good to integrate the knowledge from science, from art and archaeology to reconstruct the past societies. Therefore, on this picture, you can see that in the future, this question mark, we don't know how the archaeology is going to develop in the future, but it certainly will interact with other disciplines as well. So we are not a closed, small discipline, but interconnected with all other in our environment.
Yeah, and that's not only just in terms of the method, it's also in terms of our theories and how we approach understanding the human past. So for instance, in my own work, I draw heavily on anthropology as a discipline. So I look beyond kind of the narrow confines of just looking at material culture, looking at archaeology. And I try to understand certain processes that I'm interested in, such as migration, movement, from a long-term perspective. So it's both about how we do things, but also how we think about things. So ultimately, why should you care? Why does archaeology matter? And to me, the greatest thing is that it really allows us to challenge established ideas and develop new and more nuanced understanding of our past. So for me personally, I look at the end of the late Bronze Age, and you might more be familiar with it in terms of Troy and the Hittites and the Mycenaeans and the Great Trojan War in the Homeric epics. But for me, really what I'm interested in is looking at how did people move during, different types of societal collapse. Did people stop moving? Did people move more? What are kind of the general patterns of that? But I can give you a much closer example, and that's, for instance, let's think about COVID and what's happening right now. These diseases did not only happen in the past, in the present, but also in the past. And we do study them, and we are developing new, more nuanced understanding about how we study them. So there's a lot of important questions that we connect between the past and the present. It's not only the pandemics and the bad, but it's also good things like technological innovation. Mobility and migrations, which really gave people the chance to interact, to exchange ideas. And the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean, was incredibly productive in that way. For instance, the first time that really pan-Mediterranean globalization happened was in the early first millennium. So before really a lot of the Greek city-states rose, and those are all the different things that we study.
Yeah, and it's not only about work, but it's also about games, since archaeology can be applied really widely. And last years, it's also interconnected with computer games, which is really increasing business. And we choose only these two pictures. You certainly know it, Assassin's Creed or Total War. And for sure, the archaeologists collaborated with the creators of the games. For example, this Total War Rome 2 was collaborating with them as well, 2014, where we gave advice to the creator of these games. And this is also one way how we can spread the knowledge about the ancient world, and to see that it's not only about learning, about reading, but to be interested in means also to touch the ancient civilizations. And if the computer games allowed us, then it's also good for archaeology.
Yeah, so I think this is all from us at this point, and we're happy to talk more and discuss any questions that you might have.
We actually have received a question on Slido about what are your favorite computer games connected to archaeology. So if you play any, since you just mentioned it, maybe you can share with us a
bit. If I may, Jana.
I don't. That's my answer, but Marek does.
Yeah, I think I answered it with the last two slides, and it's not also only about playing, but some colleague of mine who are doing ancient history, not archaeology specifically, are using, for example, Rome Total War to teaching their students about the geography or topography of the ancient Mediterranean. This means where these, let's say, kingdoms were, or who were the kings, since some of these games are really precisely in terms of the details. So in this way, you can, in a really nice way, learn all the data, which you would otherwise only have to read and thick books and remember everything. In this way, you can learn these details. However, if you want to go deep into the subject and then the study, this is not the way. This is only one option how to get interest in this topic.
Yeah, and it's cool because it goes the other way around too. So a lot of the archaeological projects have increasingly been collaborating with gamers and people who actually, create these games in trying to make archaeology, material remains, and ruins more attractive to the audiences, to the tourists who come in. So for instance, kind of the virtual reality boom has come in conversation with the interest of the gaming industry in the ancient world and all the different mythological stories stories of these great wars, such as the Trojan War.
Hello, so I didn't get a chance to introduce myself yet. I'm Philip and I'm a year 2 student on leave. And so I can pick up another question from Slido, which is the most popular one yet. What are some of the biggest achievements of Slovak archaeologists from maybe like from your studies period or in general?
Okay, maybe I try to answer this question since Jana made all this study abroad, and I was in contact with the Slovak archaeology in the past. Slovak archaeology is really rapidly developed in the last, let's say, 20, 30 years, and I will pick up only one of them. So there are several others, let's say, biggest achievement. And the one I really like, is the work that Slovak archaeologists conducted and are still conducting in Central America, in Guatemala, where they are studying, if I remember properly, the ancient Maya civilization. So they published really nice papers also in the most impacted journals like Nature. So this is a work of Slovak archaeologists which also make an echo in abroad. But there are a lot of others, and yeah, I think in the future there will be also Slovak archaeologists who can really answer this question in detail in this webinar.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing is that, you know, there are a lot of Slovak archaeologists who are, you know, who are working abroad, but also who are working in Slovakia. And I think for me, in terms of Slovak archaeology in Slovakia, most important is the outreach. Just from my own perspective, as you know, if I go back home and I have friends from abroad who are studying, you know, all over the world, and they come and visit, I think I'm quite impressed with the new ways they are making sites accessible. So in the region, in my hometown in Liptovské Mikuláš, there is definitely a lot of good work done on Havanok and other of the Celtic period habitations. So I think what's really good in Slovakia is the outreach is becoming more and more prominent.
Okay, so there's also a question, since you were talking about how you kind of came to studying archaeology, there's a question on YouTube about what should a young person ask themselves if they consider to study something connected to archaeology or any kind of area in this?
So I definitely, it's not an easy subject in terms of you basically need to be motivated enough to study a lot, just because it's not only, you know, what we presented as archaeology. So it's not only what you read and how you understand archaeological things, but it's also a lot of work on your languages. So it's definitely, if you want to study archaeology, make sure that, you know, you speak German and English, or at least you can read them. If you're in classical archaeology, which is our background, we also had to, you know, at university study Greek and Latin. So you need to be a person who is okay with fluctuating between kind of the more humanities oriented subjects, languages, the more social scientifically, you know, oriented subjects, and also sciences. So I do have a training, for instance, in geographical information system at Akdastu. So you need to be motivated to do different things, and you need to be comfortable with doing different things, which to me personally is also really exciting because you don't get bored by doing the same thing every day.
I would agree. This is the most important thing. It's not only about traveling to different countries, but that you have to be open for all these new things. And we didn't mention, for example, now the social sciences, that psychology or sociology. So you have to read a lot of things. You have to be aware of what is happening in the world, and always think about this, and to think about the same, or not searching, but think about the patterns, because the same thing happened also in the past. And in the reverse, you can actually think in a different way about the current situation and about the current events. So be open. This is the most important thing.
So Jana.
Yeah, I have
sure.
sort of, you know, I was interested in myself. You were mentioning how while studying archaeology, you had to learn, well, Latin and, as you mentioned, Greek. Tell me, what was your kind of perception of studying, you know, a dead language? Do you find it useful? And sort of how's your sort of relationship with studying those languages? And how well do you really like learn during the university? Because it's just really interesting for me, I guess.
I can start. There is a reason why I'm a prehistorian. I like learning languages I can use. But you know, I like learning ancient Greek. I think, especially if you're an English native speaker, it helps you a lot with your grammar. In the UK and in Canada and the States, there is not as much emphasis. So for me, actually learning these languages in the North American context was much easier than for a lot of speakers, you know, who only speak English. I personally did not enjoy it as much. It's not my strength. My strength is talking to people. So I learn languages better if I can speak, and I do speak Italian from high school, you know, English, of course, a little bit of Turkish, and a little bit still of modern Greek. But it is important because it allows you to understand much more from the ancient world. It's not easy. The ancient languages are much more complicated than any, I think, of the kind of, you know, European spoken Indo-European languages that we use now in the modern world, Europe.
As a classic archaeologist, I learned both Latin and Greek. And I had good teachers in Trnava, so I'm really glad that basically regarding Latin, it was a nice time, and it helps in the different ways. So first, it helps a lot to understand the logic behind the language. So I can say I learned Slovak after I understand Latin. I mean Slovak grammar, and then also in the German grammar the same. On the other hand, it helps you to understand the logic of the behind the, let's say, Greek or Roman culture and civilizations, because language is one part of the what we are calling habitus. That means of a cultural package of a civilization. And if you don't understand this, then it's hardly to understand or to try to reconstruct the past civilizations. This is the if you would try to understand Slovaks without speaking Slovak.
Yeah, and I think that Marek made a really important point, and that, you know, you also kind of understand that everything you read is an interpretation, and I think that's really important for learning ancient Greek and Latin, that you might not really want to think about when you're, you know, learning English or Slovak. I also had really amazing teachers, and I did enjoy learning them, even though, you know, you know, I like the material culture, I like the dirt, but I think they're really good at showing us how much of the language is cultural, how much of it is a perception, and it makes you question things at a deeper level, and I think that's really important for you know, for your studies.
So, Jana, you briefly mentioned this in your presentation, or you started on this in your presentation, and there's also a question on Slido about this. How did your fascination with archaeology begin?
It definitely began when I studied in Italy at UWC, United World Colleges, when I was in high school. You know, and that was 15 years ago. And at that point, it was really hard to imagine doing something like that in Slovakia. And once I was abroad, I really liked being abroad. I really liked traveling, and the fact that I don't have to be tied down to one place. And Italy was quite interesting because we did a lot of trips to, you know, Rome, and which is an incredibly historical cities, but I also took a subject that was called world cultures, that, you know, focus on kind of ethnography and archaeology, anthropology and art history in a kind of very brief way. But it did show me that you can do something kind of inspiring and inventive whilst you're being kind of interested in the kind of the more hardcore scientific aspects of it. So to me, that was quite a bit of a motivation that, wait a minute, I don't have to do this one thing, but I can, you know, doing a number of things I enjoy at the same time. And then I really got lucky because when I did my undergrad in Canada, I got a scholarship at a school that had a strong archaeological presence and a really good professors. And I think that's what's quite important to realize is that it didn't just happen to me, but a part of it, I also made it happen. So before I came to my undergraduate institution, I wrote to my teachers, to my professors, and asked them, this is what I'm interested in. What should I do? What should I take? You know, how should I go about doing my degree? And you know, just having good teachers was also quite important because they showed me that it's possible. There is a future in what you do and what you like.
Okay, so there's a question on YouTube, which is, what is the current situation with repatriation in the world, which is like stolen and saved cultural heritage? And for example, will the British Museum ever return these stolen artifacts? Should they?
And if I may, this is a good question because Jana and me, we have studied and we are coming from different archaeological schools. And there are these two schools, that means the British and the German, are also dealing with dealing differently with this question. So the Germans, for example, they have started to repatriate the stolen artifacts, or I wouldn't say stolen, but artifacts from the foreign countries that both in the 19th century and the beginning of 20th century back to the countries of origins. And now there is a big discussion, not only about the artifacts or objects from Greece and Turkey, but also about the objects from Western Africa, Tanzania. So the discussion is very dynamic, and the German government have started to return some objects back to Turkey, for example. I don't think they will return Pergamon altar in the future, but there is a discussion about this. And
from like I can kind of answer the role of the British Museum. So we need to realize that these big museums that we usually think about are a product of the colonial past. So you know, during the British Empire and so on, and there is this pervasive argument of a lot of the museums is that you know your culture is global, that it doesn't belong to anyone. So you know, when you ask questions like that, they're also highly political because on the one hand you do want to make sure that cultural heritage is represented and it belongs to everybody, that everybody has the chance to see, to engage, to interact. But there is a huge discussion right now about how do you do it? What is the value of taking these artifacts out of the places where they were found? So I do have to say that there are a lot of museums who are doing incredible work with repatriation, but also to give agency to the people to whom these objects mean a lot. And these objects are not only shown as you know, something, an object of art to be admired, to have a monetary value. But I do have to say that from my own personal experience, those tend to be the smaller local museums that have these stands. As for the Elgin marbles in the British Museum is not going to let them go. And a part of it, even if, so the background to it is that technically Lord Elgin had a permission from the Ottoman government to collect some sculpture from around the Parthenon that was on the ground. Of course, he went beyond that. And of course, for members of the nation, of the Greek nation, the Ottomans were never an authority that had the right to say what happens with their cultural heritage. And for them, kind of the material past was really important in the building of the Greek state and Greek independence in the 19th century. The problem here is not even all of this historical context. The problem is that once you start returning things from your collections, that will create a domino effect, that more and more states, more and more countries are going to ask of you to return the things that were taken, during the different colonial eras, which of course the big museums cannot really afford to lose these, collections. So there is a markedly highly political conversations that are going on at the moment, really all over the world.
So back to the previous question, we'd love to hear from you, Marek, as well, on how your fascination with archaeology started.
It's actually really simple or basic. Since I'm generation of 90s, so I saw Indiana Jones first. Yeah, but really, I mean, I was always interested in ancient history. Also during my gymnasium time, and then at the university, the first focus was on ancient history. But after, let's say, 2 semesters at the university, I understand that if I want to go beyond what was written and beyond, let's say, or let's call it propaganda, because it was a propaganda, mostly, what was written in the antiquity, then I have to have a look at the material culture. And step by step, I learned a lot about the material culture, and the interest increased slowly. And I think at the end of my study, end of my MA, I made the decision to focus only on archaeology. Therefore, then the PhD in Germany, which was only on archaeology and not on the history as during my MA. Yeah, but Indiana Jones was the first impulse.
So a very interesting question, I think, is on Slido. To both of you, if you could choose to time travel to any period or person from history, which one would it be and why?
Marek, do you want to answer first? I'll need to think about this.
Time travel, always fascinating. As a funny thing, actually, indeed, you can, to let's say a certain degree, do it already now. So you have to only play Assassin's Creed, and you will meet some personalities from ancient Greece, like Pericles or Alcibiades in ancient Athens. You can speak with them. So, but in general, I mean, yeah, the period around 1200 to 1100 BC will be interesting to visit, since it showed us, or it is a transition period before the after the decline of a big connected Mycenaean civilization and the rise of what we know as ancient Greece. So it was a period of a transition where all things were or went down and new things were emerging. So I like collapse, so therefore this period.
Oh, and for me, yeah, I think I would go definitely back to the Bronze Age too, and Western Turkey, where I study. But I don't know, to tell you the truth, I wouldn't also mind seeing London in the Roman times. I think what I'm fascinated is seeing a lot of the modern landscape just without being so populated. And I think we don't really realize how much has the landscapes really changed over time. And that's definitely true for London, for instance. So a lot of the London around Westminster, where the governmental buildings are, it was all just, swamps and islands, really. So I think that I would like to see that. I would like to see, how the landscape I'm really familiar with looked kind of 3,000, 2,000 years ago at different stages. So yeah, maybe that, like, if I don't go to like the late Bronze Age and I don't know, Hattusha, the center of the Hittite Empire, or something like that.
Okay, so there's a question we wanted to ask with Philip before. So kind of since, do you hear me? It's fine now. Yeah, since you had a massive experience of sort of writing and reading a lot of academic papers and works while working with archaeology, what do you think are the main kind of mistakes, since the webinar is mostly for high schoolers, what do you believe are the main mistakes which are made usually by high schoolers in terms of writing and reading, like writing academic papers, and what are sort of your key advices in terms of that?
Okay, so I've done quite a bit of teaching writing as a part of my teaching too, actually, both in the States and here. The biggest mistake that anybody does is they do not take enough time to write. They do not proofread and they do not edit. And that's my kind of biggest pet peeve too. I think it's important to realize that it takes time to write, and it takes time to write well. And that, you know, if you sit and you just churn out your paper in a night, it's just, no matter how brilliant you are, it's probably not going to be a good paper. So structuring and planning, to me, are kind of the two undervalued things in writing students' papers. And one thing you do have to think about when you write is logic. So I think the other advice I would give is, whenever you write something, start with an outline where you organize what you want to say. And once you actually, you know, write something down, read it out loud to see if you explain what you're trying to explain. Don't try to sound too jargony. Say what you mean. Just make sure that you are describing it well, and do it well in advance. Like, you know, take a week to write something, even if, you know, your paper is due in 2 weeks. Do it now so you have time to reflect on it and rewrite if need be. Marek?
I totally agree with you. And I would add only that if you are working with deadlines, since I'm a person who is working with deadlines, but I learned one thing. So put the deadline not a night before you have to submit the paper. But as Jana told you, you need at least a few days to do some proofreading and editing of the paper. So, and you will be surprised at the end of the work, the paper is going to look very well. So as only this draft you will write during a night. So you need a clear structure, you need the time, and there should be also logic behind it. And of course, there is a difference if you are using or if you're writing in this, let's say, call it the UK style. That means you have a hypothesis and then you try to prove this hypothesis. Or if you are doing, let's call it Central European or German style, that you are adding all the data and then evaluate it. You have to know at the beginning what we are going to do.
Yeah, and how you're going to do that. The other important thing is think about who's going to read that paper. What's the audience? What do they know? And perhaps that's something that students don't really think about. Who, at what level is your paper? Is it just for a general audience that knows nothing? Or are you writing for an audience that knows something about the subject? How do you explain things? To what detail do you go? So think about, you know, how you go about something. Take the time to do it. At least, you know, have an extra night before you have to submit so that you can, you know, reread it. And think about who are you writing for. And perhaps kind of last but not least, you know, I still grew up without having a personal computer until I was in university. You know, we had a computer at home, we had a computer room in high school, so I'm much more used to doing things with pen and paper. And even if you're working from your screen, if you think that it's okay, once you print it out and you read it, you'll find that it actually wasn't that okay. So the other kind of trick is just print out each time before you submit something.
So there is a question on Slido, and you talked about in the presentation that archaeology is not only about excavating and going into the field. There's a question on Slido if there are some other myths about what archaeologists do, but are not actually true.
Good question. So we are definitely not traveling through jungle and searching for some treasures, except of our colleagues from Guatemala. But yeah, it's hard to answer. Jana?
Yeah, it's much less glorious than it seems. So, you know, some people are the adventurous type, some are not. I think it's, yeah, you're not some sort of a, like definitely Indiana Jones or anything like that. You do not destroy things as you work, which Indiana Jones does all the time, and it drives me crazy. I hope not everybody in archaeology is macho, which is, you know, the way it's portrayed in the movies. Yeah, but it's not all that shiny. It's actually really not that often that you find, you know, big treasures or something like that. And very often, even if you find something cool, you know, it tends to happen at the end of the season where you just don't want to deal with that because you're tired and it's a lot of work to document. So in a sense, it's a bit more tedious and less glorious. Yeah.
but on the other hand, I mean, the other myth would be that we are only sitting in a library and writing, like other, let's call it social sciences. We are also working outside, and we already described what we are doing. So it's a good mix of both, of adventure, or let's call it adventure, and the working in library or laboratory. And the maybe the most important thing is you are working with the people. So the human interaction.
Yeah, so I think in a lot of the movies about archaeology, you have kind of the fearless leader that goes ahead, and that's a myth. It's a teamwork. You know, it's somebody says, I did that, you have to translate it as our team did that, or, you know, months or years of study.
So there is a question, you kind of briefly mentioned it before. I can kind of combine two of them on Slido, which is one about metal detectors and how do you use them in archaeology, and do you use them at all? And the question about the way the technology right now in the world sort of, you know, transformed the archaeological process. If you could, I don't know, add something or expand on it.
If I may, I mean, the question with the metal detector, I would answer it in the way that a metal detector is a tool, and tool is not a problem. Or tool is not doing some difficulties. The persons behind the tool is always the issue. There are different ways how to deal with these looters or people who are using metal detectors as a private persons, and there are different strategies how to deal with this. I think the most important thing, if you are speaking about these people and about this problem, because it is a problem, is to integrate the communities, the local communities, into our research, or on the other hand, integrate our research in the life of the local communities, that they understand the local, or let's say the local cultural tradition. And if they understand it, or if we are capable to show them why the local tradition culture was important, then we will only seldom deal with this issue. And it works. These are not only words, but this strategy works in Denmark, in Northern Germany, and in other countries in Europe. On the other hand, you have countries in Europe where you point out only one specific period, and you show, okay, this was the period where we have a lot of gold and other things, and that the people go out to the fields and are searching for this gold. So it's always important to to be in contact with the local communities to protect the cultural heritage, because it is cultural heritage. So this is the one question of the metal detectors, and regarding the technology, I will left it to Jana.
Yeah, so no, I completely agree with what Marek said. The metal detectorism is a problem, and different countries, again, have different strategies how to deal with it. So the UK is actually quite good about involving the public in archaeological research. So here you can get a permission quite easily to do your own metal detecting, but then you work with the local authorities on how do you report the finds and you know, whether you can keep a part of it or not. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that archaeology is a highly politicized, highly structured discipline that kind of goes just beyond the academic research. So in terms of the new technologies, I think that the biggest hit in the last 5 years really was kind of the takeout of drones, drone photography, that made just revolutionize everything how we do things. So when I worked in Turkey in this late Bronze Age, large late Bronze Age site, for us to go with a GPS and actually by hand measure the extent of the site took a whole season or two. And now with drones and aerial photography and photogrammetry, you can have it done in a morning. And as a result of that, we got also much better at modeling what we excavate in 3D right on the computer. So for instance, now what most of the archaeological projects do, as opposed to drawing everything like architects, and you have to think about what we excavate is the three-dimensional space, right? Where we're doing volumes. But the way traditionally archaeological plans are drawn are 2D. So you have, you know, scaled architectural drawings. But there was a complete turn in the last 5 years where all of a sudden, again, you know, kind of related to the computer and computing revolution, we started being able to model these in different softwares, and then we can, you know, use mapping softwares to actually incorporate these 3D volumes and 3D information. So we can actually kind of, you know, peel back everything in the computer. So I think that's really cool, and it really helped us and is helping us think about, you know, our methods and strategies.
So I would kind of have a follow-up to that, since we talked about like how the public kind of gets involved in the archaeology. I wanted to ask you how big is the part of the main discoveries in the archaeology were kind of, you know, found completely accidentally, not on purpose of discovering something? Because I think I was once reading about something where one of the most major sort of the prints on the in the caves, like the hands or something, that was actually discovered by people completely randomly on the walk with a dog or something like this. So how kind of big is the amount of archaeological discoveries that were accidental or made by non-professionals?
I think it's a good mix. So yeah, you're talking about the Neolithic caves in France, and those are really cool. So you know, like, it depends. Really, a big part of archaeology relies on people's knowledge of the area where we work. So, for instance, just to give you an example again from the project where I worked in Turkey, my project directors have been working in the area for many years and decided that they want to launch a survey. And it was only then when they discovered in 2009 one of the largest late Bronze Age citadels in Western Turkey that wasn't previously known. And the way they discovered this is that they were surveying in the area. They weren't, you know, thinking of going up the hill, but then their dog ran away and they stumble upon, you know, the hill, the top of the hill, and they're like, wait a minute, I think we see buried fortifications around. So it's both, but we're getting better at being systematic about it, especially with the drone technologies and the remote sensing that Marek talked about. But, you know, historically, when I worked in Georgia, really, what we did is we asked the locals what they know about material culture, what was found, and we systematized that knowledge. So, you know, it is a good mix, and the locals always know best, really, what's around, how things look.
I totally agree. Yes, I mean, there is also one another let's call it technology. It's the LIDAR, that means laser airborne scanning, which reveals a lot of unknown sites where we can see structures on the surface. So in this way, also in Germany, they found several hilltop sites, Celtic hilltop sites, but also Roman watchtowers from the limes. So let's say the methodology regarding survey is going better and better, but we still depend on the knowledge, on the local knowledge, because the local people who were born in the regions know the region in the best way.
So we already heard from you some technological changes that archaeology has had since the past. But what do you think archaeology will look like in, let's say, 50 years? Will it look roughly the same, or will it be completely different?
In 50 years, I mean, let's have a look what changed in the last 20 years. So development is really rapid, and so for this reason, I wouldn't speak about 50 years, but let's say what's going to be changing in the next 10 years. For sure, it will be the augmented reality, which is going to influence the way we are working on the one hand, and on the other hand, big data also in archaeology. So at the moment, if you are dealing with ceramic, it means to understand the local development, both the chronology as well as any contacts with the other areas. So the first step is that we are working on a typology. That means to make any types, to create the types. But in the future, there will be software who is actually taking this work from us and doing it in an automatic way. And for this reason, also this, as we showed, this tool to scanning of the shards. 5 years ago, everybody is drawing these shards. In the moment, the excavation or the teams who have not only this type, but also different types of this tool, they are automatizing it. So this is the way archaeology is going to change in the next, let's say, 10 years, the automatization. But this is also one aspect, of course. There should be another, will be another aspects.
Yeah, I think that, yes, definitely the increasing reliance on kind of computer softwares on automation is a big one. I think that we will excavate less, just because, you know, the old trend was, you know, large excavations, try to uncover as much as you can. But that goes hand in hand with increased realization that that is a lot of responsibility, that you need to, you know, create a management strategy, heritage plan for what you excavate. How do you present it to the public and so on? And as we get better, we do more and more analysis on what we excavate, and they still take a lot of time, but we can tell much more. So I think as a result of that, there will be much more of an emphasis on these, you know, on these different analysis and post-processing, and we will excavate in a much more localized and targeted way. And again, because we will be able to do more with it, we'll be able to document it better, but also we'll be able to represent it better to the public.
And so with the future, maybe in the next 50 years, how the question in Slido said, there will be an increased automatization in jobs. And so do you think archaeology is endangered in the loss of jobs, maybe due to AI, or do you think that this can help archaeology become maybe even more efficient?
Definitely the second. It's going to be more efficient because there's the issue of interpretation. And for the moment, we see that the KI is dealing only with the analytical part. Of course, there are some tests, but on the other hand, I mean, the interpretation, which is the most important part of archaeology, because you can get the data in terms of laboratory analysis, fine processing or excavation or remote sensing, but you have to interpret it. You have to reconstruct it, to take the essence and to understand what's behind the data. So like the data analysts, there is this is a job which will be also important in the future. We are data analysts in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And for us, I think what endangers our positions and job opportunities really is the changing education and heritage sectors. So for instance, in the West, there have been very radical cuts to the humanities, where archaeology usually sits within the higher education. So it's more about cutting, you know, professorial and lecturer positions that endanger what we do, as opposed to, you know, the increased reliance on new methods and computer and automated technologies.
Okay, so I have a question from myself, sort of. Since we're already talking about the jobs, how are the chances of, when you finish sort of an archaeological degree or something in this area, what are the chances of actually being involved in sort of the research and you know, findings? Is it difficult? Does it have like a difficult situation with sort of employability or finding projects that you can do, and you know, how reliable it is that when you were interested in it and that when you finish a degree, you will find something to do?
Jana?
Okay. So it's difficult to find a university position. That has become increasingly difficult because of the changes to the way university recruit for permanent staff that I just mentioned. It's much easier if you'd like to work in archaeological outreach. So we have a lot of colleagues who do participate in archaeology, but for instance, for professional archaeological companies. And that's definitely the case, for instance, in the UK, where there is a really huge professional archaeological sector for what we call cultural research management, which means that anytime somebody wants to build something, you do have to have archaeological prospection done on those premises to make sure that you are not destroying something historically valuable. So there is quite a bit of opportunities in, I'd say, perhaps not in the core, you know, kind of the academic stream of you know, really, you know, being a lecturer or professor at a university, but there is a lot that you can be engaged with on kind of these related job positions. So whether it's cultural research management, I have a couple of friends and colleagues who work professionally as illustrators, or you know, as people who do a lot of the programming, who work with geographic information systems and mapping. So basically, if you want to study, what I'd recommend is that you also get really well trained in one of the methods, so you can kind of broaden your scope. And I think that's very useful. Marek?
For sure, yes. I mean, we show the slide. What is archaeology about? That means survey, excavation, etc. And so any of this point, there is a possibility to work in. It's not only about research, but it's also about rescue excavation. It's about GIS analytic or drawing, etc.
Yeah, and it's also, the other thing is, of course, museums, heritage outreach, heritage organizations. Funnily enough, in the UK, actually, a lot of the students then go on and study law degrees because archaeology is very evidence-based. So then people like to do this for a while, and then, for instance, they go on like something like journalism or you know, data science. So again, kind of connected to seeing the patterns.
Yeah, this is really important that if you decide to study archaeology and then I don't know, you can't find any job directly after you finish your study, the positive thing in archaeology is that you are a generalist, and you can use the knowledge you gained during your study or during the work on the projects to to try a different job profession for example, in printing houses or newspapers, or also data analysts, or use your language skills, etc. So you won't be unemployed after you finish archaeology. That's the most important thing.
Thank you very much.